Hello, Lance Weiler. Welcome to the Faculty of Communication. Welcome to Granada University. We are extremely excited and happy to have you here, and thankful for giving us your time for this little talk and interview. As you know, we have entitled our conference Transmedial Narrative Monsters at the Border of Fiction and Non-Fiction. You're here to talk us about your concept of digital storytelling. How would you hook or connect this idea of monstruosity and working in the borders with your practice and concept of digital interactive storytelling?
Well, I think what's interesting about it is sometimes you often feel like you're a monster. You feel like you're speaking a language maybe that other people don't understand sometimes, and you're kind of at the edges of what's possible. So you're not really sure. I think in a sense, your own identity is kind of fractured. You know, your digital identity is fractured in interesting ways. So I think the way that I kind of look at it is it's a really interesting time to be making the work. And so I think about digital storytelling as an opportunity to kind of shape new narratives and what might they look like. So this idea of new forms and functions of storytelling, you know, borrowing from work that came before, looking at new opportunities. So in many ways I feel like kind of, I guess, technology agnostic. It doesn't necessarily matter as much what the technology is. It's really about the emotional core. So in that sense, the border, I guess, is maybe that border of trying to stay true to what I'm trying to express emotionally with the challenges that exist in terms of all the fragmentation, you know, in terms of new emergent technologies, and not getting caught up in the technology, but trying to hold on to simplicity, which is difficult when you have transmedial-based projects in such a fragmented landscape.
Talking about transmediality, I remember last year in New York, in the States, I met you at the Future Storytelling Festival, and I had the impression that transmedia itself is something like overcome or surpassed in the discourse of people like you. If you would have to define very briefly transmediality in your actual current practice, what would you say?
I think it's, to me, the part that's most exciting is that tension point with kind of those formerly known as the audience, and the fact that everybody is a storyteller now. And I think that's a really fascinating place. And thinking about what that means in terms of scripting or making work for multi-platforms, or you know, kind of looking at the way that you don't have to adhere to a running time or a format, and the work kind of becomes almost ubiquitous. I think that relationship to those formerly known as the audience is probably the part that I'm most interested in. I'm most interested in this idea of large kind of collaborations and this friction between ownership and authorship of stories. And so I think in a lot of regards that's where I'm kind of leaning in terms of the work. So from a transmedia standpoint, it's not so much by the classic definition to me of what it is, you know, in terms of the work being across multi-platforms or having that world extension. I find myself more and more interested in the participatory culture aspects of it, and then also into a lot of the purposeful storytelling side, a lot of the, you know, trying to do things that are related to action-oriented, social change-oriented work.
Was going to be my next question. I mean, you're a teacher as well. Quite a good number of your projects have a clear social-oriented profile. Would you say that social activism is more or less embedded into these new forms of digital storytelling?
Well, I think that what's interesting, when I had mentioned earlier new forms and functions of storytelling, we explore that at the Digital Storytelling Lab. And so a lot of the work is kind of looking and saying, you know, forms could be you know, new emergent technologies like artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, augmented reality, virtual reality. And then the functions could be, you know, story as a healing tool, as a communication tool, a mobilization tool, learning, and obviously entertainment. And so I think the part that I'm really fascinated by is this idea of co-design, you know, co-creation and co-design, and taking a hive mind approach to some of the most challenging topics that we face through a diversity of participants, you know, and how do you build frameworks? And it feels like storytelling to me feels like a very, and the kind of working towards a shared narrative feels like a very interesting way to make social change. You know, that people come in and they become part of it, and it's not that you're out designing something and then kind of dropping it in and saying, here's the solution. It's like everybody together is working to shape those solutions and finding it as they go, because it has equal voice and footing, and I think that that's really important. So I find the work, I find that generative side of it fascinating, and the challenge of that fascinating in terms of the problem solving of it. But I think in many regards, a lot of the work kind of looks towards how can we use story as a tool for change. And also I think if you just look at it culturally or politically, narratives are what drive you know, the world that we live in. So the more that people are aware of how they can be a part of a narrative as opposed to just consuming a narrative, I think makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, there are many different kinds of monster storytellers around.
Yes.
One of the most attractive things of your work lately, in my view, is this connection between literary, popular myths like Sherlock Holmes and now Frankenstein. Why is it, and what is Frankenstein artificial intelligence that you're going to present today?
I think what's really fascinating is kind of looking at classic literature, and a lot of the themes or the challenges that they were facing are very relevant now. Like if you look at, in particular, if you look at Frankenstein, you know, whether it's science versus nature, whether it's isolation versus connectedness, you know, if I look at algorithms and how algorithms work, they are kind of like a Frankenstein's monster, right? They're kind of off in the world. They have little bits and pieces of us in them, but they, you know, we look and, you know, we can be repulsed by what they do or how they serve us things, and yet we don't fully understand them, yet we are a part of creating them. So I think that being able to mine themes in that work, but then also really with the work that we're doing, both at the lab and the work that I do in my own practice, to be able to have a shared common language around something is incredibly valuable. And Frankenstein and Sherlock Holmes have that. And I think even if your knowledge of Frankenstein is like Universal Pictures 1931, yeah, or Hammer or any of those, hopefully what this does is kind of introduces you back to the original text, the original intention of what Mary Shelley was writing. And I think that that's pretty exciting. So that ability to kind of look to the past and then mash it up in an interesting way with these truly emergent technologies, I feel gives it a frame and a foundation that allows you to push further into what you can do with those technologies. So in the case of Frankenstein AI, it's really algorithmic storytelling. It's really like this living, breathing creature that is kind of out of control in some regards, but then also really rooted in this idea of humanity, you know, because how can we, you know, how can humanity help to shape technology before technology shapes us, right? And so a lot of Frankenstein becomes a wonderful jumping off point for that. But what's interesting is when we're doing the project, which has people kind of co-creating with an artificial intelligence, the stories that come from it aren't as dystopian as they are normally when you would just ask somebody about AI. You know, they would say, oh, it's automation, it's going to take our jobs, or they would talk about Terminator or Skynet or something, you know what I mean, or some Hollywood version of it. So it's really interesting to kind of introduce these ubiquitous technologies that people don't know what they are, except for the fact that maybe it's a personal assistant in their mobile device that kind of works sometimes, doesn't work other times, you know, but it's really very pervasive.
The implications for human self-perception and citizenship identification in this dialogue with technology, the political implications of this thought of thinking that is behind your work is paramount. How would you try to synthesize or reflect on that political side of this area that you were experimenting with?
Well, I think some of it, when I think about it, it's this ability to be architects of the future, not victims of it, you know, which is a Buckminster Fuller quote. Obviously, I'm paraphrasing it, but that's a fascinating concept to me, you know, that we don't necessarily have to wait for someone else to do it, that we can be active, we can be engaged, and we can be a part of the potential solution space for it. And I think ironically, in the world that we live in that is so quote unquote connected, we crave human connection even more than we have in the past. And I think being able to realize that you can be part of a solution helps connect you to other human beings. And I think any way that we can do that, I think is a step forward. And I think it moves you more towards civil discourse. It moves you more towards empathy. It moves you more towards things that allow you to actively listen, you know, to be able to be present. Things that are at odds often with digital culture, you know, which has such a churn and it's so fast. So I think in a lot of regards, I'm kind of trying to look for moments in work that allow for that reflection. Like, how do you create space that allows people to be comfortable with that reflection? Because I think often a lot of the things that we do are so transactional based, especially within digital culture. You know, it's you know, that's very much at odds with I think some of the things that we truly need as a human race. So.
And finally, your career it's been built in the U.S. You've traveled to Europe many times, different countries, different scenarios and frameworks. Taking into account the differences of productive tissue and economics between your environment and our environment here in south of Spain, what would be your advice for these guys starting to think how to set up innovative digital storytelling narratives? What would be the key stones that you would advise to step on for beginners?
Well, I think one thing is to break from permission-based culture. You don't have to wait for somebody to give you permission to try something, to do something. So I think the more that you can kind of test and break whatever the ideas are, the further you'll be able to take the career that you want to have. I think the other side is being willing to embrace ambiguity. The reality of the situation is there is no one clear path. And the more that you can embrace and go with that, I think the more attractive you will be to collaborators. I think the other thing is to really think about those who are studying with you. They are colleagues and peers that can challenge you, and those are relationships that can last you a lifetime in terms of being really wonderful collaborators. But I'd say, like, a lot of it is you know, not the self-doubt that kind of comes from it, or the concerns of like having to be able to achieve some degree of success, or wondering, you know, what's going to be next. I think embracing and trying to find that voice as a storyteller is probably one of the hardest things, but it's also, it's incredibly rewarding. You know, when you have little fleeting moments of it, it's not like you're always kind of in flux with it, I think. But I think it's a wonderful time to be a storyteller, to be a creator. I think the differences that exist between Europe and the US, primarily have been driven by capitalism, have primarily been driven by, entrepreneurship and the rise of Silicon Valley narrative in terms of, the mixture of software-based culture and storytelling. I think here in Europe, it's been a little more subsidized in terms of what that is, and that can be problematic too, because it creates certain types of check boxes and all the projects kind of adhere to that. So I'd say just be bold with what you make and not worry about necessarily what the box is. Try to move away from that and just try to make work. Because when work is true and authentic, it resonates.
That's an excellent way to close our conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lance.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.